This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's unsupervised learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hi there. You know that genetics plays a huge role in our health, and more people are using genetic testing to determine risk for diseases like cancer for themselves and their children than ever before. I want to introduce you to Orchid. It's the only company that does whole genome testing for embryos, testing before your child is born. If you're doing IVF, this is a clear choice now because you can reduce the risk for thousands of single gene disorders, including heritable forms of autism, pediatric cancers, and birth defects. Check them out at orchidhealth.com and use the code RAZIB, R-A-Z-I-B, when signing up to skip the wait list.
Hey, everybody. This is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning podcast, and I am here with a very special guest. This is what we always say, but, I do feel like it's very special. This is my second Indo-European episode with Dr. David Anthony, who a lot of you know and love, read his work, have read his book about the Horus wheel and, Indo-Europeans and all that stuff. And he's got a new book coming out, and he's got all these papers he's on with David Reich. There just took a lot to get through. So let's just start. Although, David, if you want to introduce your affiliations, where you are right now, we can do that, and then we can go.
Okay. So I'm David Anthony. The book you were talking about is The Horse, the Wheel, and Language. I just have to plug that once. I'm retired from teaching at Hartwick College in Oneonta, New York, but I'm also a research associate with David Reich's lab in human evolutionary biology at Harvard. So those are my affiliations.
Yeah. And so we got to talk, first of all, I think first let's talk about a couple of things in terms of how you feel in terms of the high-level changes over the last 2 years. Our last conversation was about 2 years ago. I also want to make sure and hit the issue with the horses because there's a lot of horse stuff that's happened, and obviously it's important in the horse wheel language to get that right. I don't think it's totally resolved, but we've made some progress since the last time we talked. So can we get to that stuff right now?
Sure, I'd be glad to talk about horses first. So there was a big paper that brought
horse before the cart.
The horse before the cart. Actually, literally, that's the way this conversation will go. There was this definitive study of horse DNA, Librato et al., 2 years ago, a project run by Ludovic Orlando, and I was a co-author on that, and that definitively determined that the kind of horses we have today, called Dom2, came together genetically in the modern genetic profile around 2300 BC in the steppes north of the Caspian Sea, the Volga-Ural steppes in what's today Russia. But it treated that as an event, the appearance of Dom2 at about 2200 BC. And the data they presented, so I disagree with the way they presented it. The data they presented actually suggests there's a long-phased evolution of domesticated horses in that region. Starting in 5500 BC with wild horses, and 4500 BC, you can see a couple of samples that are found with domesticated cattle and sheep. 4500 BC, 1,000 years after the initial wild horses, and they're shifted in the Dom2 direction. And then you have the Yamnaya and Corded horses that are the direct ancestors of Dom2, have almost all of the genetic traits of Dom2. And then finally, Dom2 itself at around 2200 BC. So there's this long history before that, and people were riding horses before Dom2 appeared. And that's, of course, the important aspect of how horses affected human culture. So then recently, just last year, there was a study by Troutman et al. That I was a co-author on, organized out of University of Helsinki by Volker Hyde. And that showed for the first time pathologies in the human skeleton that are related to riding that affect mainly the lower back, the pelvis, and the upper legs. And some of them are pathologies, like the articulation between the femur and the pelvis. Some of them are just muscle changes, but they're muscle changes that are typical of horseback riders. So you begin to see that. We had 5 cases in Yamnaya, and there were 2 cases that were pre-Yamnaya. One, the Tsongrad individual in Hungary, 4200 BC, with all of the lower trunk muscular traits of a habitual rider. I was not surprised by that because the samples in Ludovic Orlando's Liberato et al. Paper that were dated to 4500 BC showed a substantial shift in the direction of Dom2. And you put that together with a rider dated to about the same period, it's not so surprising. So I think riding goes way back in the steppes. And of course, that allowed people to move around a lot more. I don't think that they were using horses in warfare, though, because genetically, these horses were more skittish. The traits that are defined by Dom2 relate to back architecture, making it easier to carry a rider, and to mood, making it easier for the horse to tolerate the sudden movements and noises that are associated with humans. And the Yamnaya horses were probably more skittish. They didn't have the full suite of genetic traits. So I think they probably were harder to ride. Probably you didn't ride them if you were faced with an aggressive individual coming towards you. On those horses, you probably dismounted to deal with that individual. But the horse could still get you there much, much faster than anybody expected, and that's a huge advantage in tribal warfare. So I
mean, you've obviously, and like some of this you hinted at the previous podcast 2 years ago, because obviously it was in preparation. You had some of the data. So let me review or summarize and see if I'm getting this correctly in terms of your own perspective. So let's say about 4,000 years ago, we have a big bang of these light war chariots, Sintashta light war chariots in the Volga-Ural region, with particular types of horses that are very, very adapted to being hooked up on these chariots. They're larger, they're a little bit more coordinated, their docility or the ability to be directed is more domesticated, more human. And this is the star phylogeny of the modern horses, right?
Yeah.
And we see this especially in the Y chromosome with the stallions. But earlier, there were other horse lineages. And obviously, we know the Mongolian wild horse, which is related to the bow tie horse. There were European horses. There were horses in the New World at the beginning of the Holocene. They went extinct. They were probably eaten. But in any case, so the horse lineage equids are all over the place. And what you're suggesting is it was actually earlier than the Sintashta cultural explosion. There were also halting earlier events that made a difference, actually more than a marginal difference in terms of, social technology, in terms of their mobility, that gave the Yamnaya peoples, these steppe peoples, an advantage, even if they didn't have the light war horse chariot that the Sintashta spread about 4,000 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. So the Sintashta horses were fully modern in the sense that they could tolerate. There's every evidence that the earliest chariots around 2000 BC at Sintashta were used in warfare. There's weapons buried with them. And so to get a horse, an animal whose evolution is based on their skittishness, they startle very fast, and then once they startle, they're the fastest things in the Eurasian continent in terms of getting away from a threat, and that was their survival mechanism. So to get an animal like that to go forward into a threat, into warfare, took a lot of genetic manipulation, and so it happened gradually. We shouldn't think of domesticated horses as being a single thing. So I think it's fairly clear that Yamnaya people were riding horses. They certainly had the pathologies associated with horseback riding, and even earlier people probably were riding horses. But I think it was probably a trick at the time. It didn't spread quickly because it was thought of we might think of this the way we today think of camel riding. We think of it as associated with a particular area, maybe particular ethnic groups, and it's not something that everybody is going to copy and pick up and do. It's thought of something that's difficult. Maybe elephant riding might be the same kind of thing. It's seen as a skill that you find in a particular part of the world primarily, and you don't expect to find it in North America or in Italy, although you do with Hannibal. But horseback riding in the beginning, I think, was in that category. It wasn't the way we think of horseback riding. It was more difficult. And so only people who had really spent a lot of time around horses were very good at it.
Well, okay, so I'm going to stick out horses just a little bit more. Horses are super important, obviously. So let me posit something partly from reading you, Kristian Kristiansen, watching people like Dan Davies' podcasts and stuff like that, the Corios, these young men. So I'm imagining two modalities, and tell me if this is totally wrong. One modality would be kind of young braves. Maybe they get on some ponies and they use the ponies to move rapidly across the landscape to do their raids. And, they're not cavalry. They're not fighting from the ponies. They use the ponies to move. And then there's another modality where you have these ponies maybe dragging carts, maybe more domestic usage. I don't know. I know they have oxes, so they don't need ponies necessarily.
So I think you're essentially right. There's a modality where you can use horses in warfare, even if you're not cavalry, just to get to the place. And actually, when you look at Plains Indian warfare, very often, they brought boys who held onto the horses while the men went and conducted the raid, and they came back and they rode away. The other, though, I think the more important usage of horses early on was that they greatly increase the efficiency of animal herding. So if you're herding cattle and sheep on foot, there's a limited number. Even if you use a dog, you can expand it, but there's a limited number of sheep that the herder can handle. And if you get on horseback, the estimates, like for Mongolian herders, are that they can handle 2 to 3 times more animals. So without an increased input in labor, horses allow you to increase your herd sizes by 2 or 3 times. And then you have a surplus in animals that you can use for political relationships, gift-giving, and feasting. And that's just as important as the warfare aspect of early riding, the fact that it made it possible to be rich, to have a surplus counted in animals as a nomad. And so the very invention, the earliest stage in the invention of steppe nomadism, which I think the Yamnaya people were the first people to really fully commit to a nomadic lifestyle. That was made possible partly by horses and then partly by wheeled vehicles. Wheeled vehicles are for your heavy residential needs, essentially moving home, food and water, fuel, and the horses are for scouting and for making your herds bigger and for warfare. And you put those two forms of transportation together, and it looks like they came together for the first time right around 3300 BC, just at the beginning of Yamnaya. And that's one of the major reasons that Yamnaya took off the way it did. They had invented a way of exploiting grasslands that nobody had ever had before.
Yeah. So, just to recap, I think the way that I would think of what you're just saying right now is obviously, for example, in England, there were fossil fuels, there was coal, and it wasn't a major resource until the 18th century. Like sometimes people would use it to fire, but it wasn't industrial. That energy was not unlocked. Once the energy was unlocked, then all of a sudden Britain became this world superpower. And so what you're positing right now is the horse is basically triggering an economic revolution that has all these knock-on effects that might be able to explain why the Yamnaya, I've done some back of the envelope math, how much Yamnaya ancestry is in the world based on and it's orders of magnitude of all of the peoples that were alive 5,000 years ago. We have hundreds and hundreds of millions of people that are Yamnaya, if you just do the multiplication of the math, right? So obviously, economic history is driving demography here. It's a little less, maybe a little less sexy than courtiers, pony riders, but it's just as important, right? And so let's talk about the wheel, horse, wheel, and language. Let's just go in sequence right now because we got this thing going right now. So what's going on with the wheel, with the cart, since you wrote your book back like 15 years ago?
Okay, so there's been a lot more wheeled vehicle finds in the steppes. The Yamnaya culture was not only the culture that had the direct ancestors of Dom-2 horses, they also had the first wheeled vehicles in the steppes. And wheeled vehicles were invented after about 3500 BC. There's no evidence for them before that. After that, they become very widespread. Between, say, 3400 BC and 3100 BC, you find wheeled vehicles from Mesopotamia to Denmark, and a lot of them in the steppes north of the Caspian and the Black Seas to present-day Russia and Ukraine. So wheeled vehicles spread across the steppes with Yamnaya, and they were central to Yamnaya ritual ideas because there are about 300, 400 wagon burials in Yamnaya graves, where they put either the whole wagon or parts of the wagon in the grave with them. And that just shows how central the wagon was to Yamnaya identity. Now, these wagons were solid wheeled. They were heavy. They weren't racing vehicles, but they were meant to carry food, water, supplies, and maybe provide a place for people to get out of the rain and to actually sleep inside. So they weren't meant to be racing vehicles. They were probably pulled by oxen and not by horses. We didn't have the proper kind of collar to put on a horse so it could carry really heavy loads without choking off the bottom of its windpipe. An ox yoke, if you put it on a horse, it hits on the bottom of the horse's neck and chokes the horse if you put really heavy weight on it. With the horse collar, the round horse collar, was a medieval invention. So before the medieval period, horses were mainly used for riding or very light traction, not for pulling things like these Yamnaya wagons. So you have to imagine the Yamnaya people kind of moving from one campsite to another with all of their domestic needs in the wagon and with the people mounted on horses. And that would allow them to spread their herds out and really efficiently manage very large herds. So if you manage large herds, though, if your herds grow in size so that you can have a surplus, you have to keep them moving unless you're going to fodder them. And there's no evidence that steppe people foddered their herd animals, even up to Genghis Khan. He's described as letting the herds out in the wintertime on the steppe. So the Yamnaya people had these horses that made the herds larger, and in order to feed the herds, you had to keep them moving because they ate up the grass in any one area. So just the fact that they became rich in animals sort of impelled them towards a way of life that kept the animals moving so they wouldn't eat everything up in a local area. I don't think it was a form of geographic determinism, by the way. It's just the way there's, in the steppes, before Yamnaya came, everybody lived in the river valleys. And it's sort of like in the United States, the Missouri River Valley going through the plains. All of the agricultural towns were in the Missouri River Valley, not out on the high plains, because that was the only place you could grow corn. The same way, in the Eurasian steppes, there are these large river valleys, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Don, that cut down through the steppes from north to south and flow into the Black and Caspian Seas. And it's in those river valleys that the whole Neolithic population before Yamnaya, everybody lived in the river valleys. That was the place where you had shelter from winter winds. There were deer, there was fish, there was firewood. There was resources in the river valleys, but they're very narrow. And so the population gets to a certain size, and you have to start looking at the grasslands in between, and nobody was exploiting that until Yamnaya. And then Yamnaya figured out a way just to keep moving, move the animals across those pastures, and so that what had been wild open steppe became a pasture that belonged to somebody. And you had to invent the entire economic and political system for managing resources that previously hadn't belonged to anybody, but now a lot of different emerging Yamnaya people are beginning to claim these places. So I think that's part of the emergence of Yamnaya too, the ability to manage group migrations through each other's territories without breaking out into warfare.
I'm gonna move to now I'm gonna move to linguistics, language, and
Okay.
So I want to talk about the Hagerty paper, and I'm just gonna give a little context here. So over the last 20 years, it's been 20 years, I don't know, more than 20 years. So there have been a group of linguists and evolutionary biologists that have come together. They've used, let me just say Bayesian phylogenetic methods. Like I've used these methods for genetics myself. It's part of my training. These are very, very tried and true tested methods. So basically the way that these things work is you have a bunch of models, you have a bunch of parameters, you run a bunch of simulations. They can't be exhaustive because you don't have billions of years, but they have ways to sample the parameter space, try to, get the best, highest probability distributions. And so it's kind of like a formal way of testing your hypotheses and figuring out what is the most probable given your data. And so they've been doing this with Indo-European languages in particular, going back, the first papers that made the media, the New York Times, date back 20 years. And they showed, for example, that the Indo-European languages are from Anatolia and they date to 10,000 years. I mean, this is like the earlier ones. Which, okay, it probably turned out to be wrong. So there's a new one out, and they've used some new methods. The paper is in Science. It's called Language Trees with Samples Ancestors Support a Hybrid Model for the Origin of Indo-European Languages. First author is Paul Hagerty. There are some DNA-type people that are on DNA papers, like Wolfgang Hock, Johannes Krauss, that are on it. So, they have some legit people there that are outside of the computational linguistics. People have been asking me what I think of the paper. Like, I just wanted to preface that the methods that they used, I've used these methods with genetic data. They're great for genetic data. But I have the results always seem really weird for linguistic data. That's what I'm going to say. And now I'm going to let David comment on it.
Well, I think that's a legitimate comment. They seem weird for linguistic data. I was at a Indo-European conference at UCLA last November. UCLA has an annual Indo-European conference, and I was a speaker there last November, and Russell Gray was a speaker there. And so I heard an hour-long presentation of this new science paper last November, and I got to also spend 2 days listening to the discussions, the linguists who were there. Quite a variety of Indo-European linguists came to the conference. I didn't hear anybody who was convinced by the dating. They were all impressed by the methodology, but they thought that it yielded really strange dates for the origins of the Indo-European languages and for the splits between the different branches, the daughter branches in Indo-European. I thought the same thing. One of the things that you have to do in order to accept their chronology is to discard what's called linguistic paleontology, which they do explicitly in their supplementary materials. And they say that you can't find the meaning of any reconstructed word in a Proto-Indo-European. Now, since I was a graduate student, one of the things that attracted me to this subject, and I'm an archaeologist, I'm not a geneticist, I'm not a linguist, but one of the things that attracted me to this subject matter is the reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European with its meanings, which give you a window, a verbal window, into the minds, conceptions, and beliefs of an entirely prehistoric society, otherwise known only through archaeology because they had no writing. And so their language has been reconstructed through the comparative method. And I thought, wow, here's this word list. It's mainly the words that I'm interested in that tell me what these people were talking about. And it included things like wheeled vehicles, which didn't exist before 3500 BC. So Proto-Indo-European had to be dated after 3500 BC because it had a rich vocabulary for wheeled vehicles, at least a semantic field of at least 5 terms, probably more like 8. And most linguists accept that you can take the Proto-Indo-European root kweklos and say that meant wheeled vehicle. It means its daughters, the daughters of that word, mean wheel or wheeled vehicle. In the daughter language, is the same with axle and a list of other words referring to wheeled vehicles. But in the Hegarty paper, they say you can't do that. That you will never know what the meaning of a reconstructed Indo-European word was, other than something very vague like the thing that turns. But most linguists don't buy that. And all of the references they gave to critics of linguistic paleontology, all of the references were from articles that are more than 25 years old. They didn't, I think there was one reference to somebody who was in this century. And for instance, the word kweklos has a reduplicated part. The K is duplicated in kweklos. It is duplicated, and it's sort of like if you took the verb turn, the turning thing, and you wanted to make a word for wheel out of it, and instead of saying the turner, you said the turnter, and you duplicated that T. That's a very specific thing. All of the roots that are in the daughter languages have that little trick in them. And that's not going to be independently invented by the daughters after they've broken up without any contact with each other. And that's what he's proposing happened with kweklos. I just don't see how such a rich body of evidence can be discarded. And if you use the wheeled vehicle vocabulary in the Indo-European, it dates at least the late phase of Proto-Indo-European to after 3500 BC. The Anatolian languages, which split off in the earliest split, that split might have happened before wheeled vehicles were invented because the Anatolian languages don't have that vocabulary. There's a recent paper by Don Ringe also that's talking about computational phylogenetic linguistics, and he was one of the first people to try to do that. And he pointed out that the results, particularly the ages, the numbers, are not robust. They have very large uncertainty margins on them. And with a very small change in methodology, you can produce dramatic changes in the ages. Consequently, the results are not, you can't set them in stone. So I have a hard time accepting the new paper. There's a new response that is just coming out on the internet now by Alexei Kassian, who's also a computational phylogenetic linguist. And he's already written a response to it, and he's quite critical. I don't see it as a definitive statement by any means.
Yeah, let me say a couple of things about it. First of all, I want to mention, I don't know what you think about this book, but Indo-European Controversy, Facts and Fallacies in Historical Linguistics by Asya Peresveg and Martin Lewis. They wrote basically it's a book length. I don't want to say Jeremiad, but a little bit against computational linguistics and basically the use of lexicon. So when you put certain types of data in, your output in these sorts of methods, which are very great, depends on the data. And so let me just make it explicit for the listener, the viewer out there. Genetics is constrained by Mendel's laws to evolve with mutation and drift and all these other things, and also the inheritance in very, very specific ways. And so when you use discrete genetic data, you can make phylogenetic inferences that are pretty good, I think, partly because it's a very constrained system. Obviously, with lexicon and cultural evolution, it's not quite like that. And so I think you're naturally going to get bigger intervals because it's a much more plastic, malleable system. Okay, that's one thing that I'm going to put out there. And I'm not saying garbage in, garbage out, but I'm kind of saying that. I don't want to say garbage because lexicon's not garbage. That's real data, but, there are limitations there. The second thing is I want to just I'm not a linguist like you, obviously, but there's certain things that in their tree, if you look at the divergence, just to be explicit, the median estimate for the start of Indo-European divergence is more than 5,000 BC, which is rather on the early side. But another thing is one of the deepest divergences is with Tocharian. And this jumps out at me because I don't know what you think, but with the Afnasivo culture, we know when they arrived in the Altai, they are probably the most likely candidate for the ancestors of the Tocharians. And they arrived not, 5,000 BC. So what's going on with that, right? Like just little things like that jump out.
Yeah, so I agree completely on the subject of Tocharian. Yeah, they have Tocharian splitting off at 5,000 BC. And there's nothing happening in the Altai or anywhere out there at 5,000 BC. They're all hunters and gatherers, and nothing new is introduced at that point. So there's no archaeology to go along with that date. And generally throughout the paper, they ignore archaeology. They just ignore it. There's no archaeological explanation for how and when these splits happened. And conversely, the biggest demographic event in the last 5,000 years in Eurasian genetic and demographic history was the expansion of steppe ancestry around 3000 BC, between 3000 and 2000 BC, and that's just a fact. And according to their version of things, the Indo-European languages were already completely diversified by then. I mean, Balto-Slavic had split off from the ancestor of Germanic, Celtic, and Italic by 4500 BC, 1,000 years before the expansion of steppe ancestry. So in their system, although they call it a hybrid hypothesis, it doesn't really include the Yamnaya expansion at all. Everything happens before the Yamnaya expansion, and therefore the Yamnaya expansion, which was this big demographic event, had no effect linguistically. So the linguistic changes that they do have are not correlated with any archaeological phenomena, and the archaeological and genetic phenomena that we do have indicating a big change are supposedly happened without any linguistic effect. And that disassociation is really difficult for me to accept.
All right, so let's move to Southern Arc paper, The Genetic History of the Southern Arc, Bridge Between West Asia and Europe. This came out last summer, the summer before this summer. So you have I know you went through the supplements, you got a lot of thoughts on this, but I'm going to read the conclusion.
Yeah.
For the listener. This is by Yosef Lazaridis, our friend Yosef Lazaridis, a friend of mine. I know he's a friend of yours. I know you know him, obviously out of the Reich lab. All ancient Indo-European speakers can be traced back to the Yamnaya culture. You probably kind of agree with that. Whose southward expansions into the Southern Arc left a trace in the DNA of the Bronze Age people of the region. However, the link connecting the Proto-Indo-European speaking Yamnaya with the speakers of Anatolian languages was in the highlands of West Asia, the ancestral region shared by both. Well, let me describe really quickly the figure for the listener. So there's a figure which basically shows the whole Black Sea region. You see the Caucasus and the Kuban steppe north of the Caucasus, and you see Armenia, Proto-Indo-Anatolians, and there's a movement north into the Pontic steppe between the Dnieper and the Volga and the Don region. And then there's reflux or like a migration out. So it's like multiple waves. And there's a really complicated way that they look at different streams of ancestry to figure out what came where in sequence. And I'm not going to try to verbally recapitulate it because it's like it's juggling a lot of things. I'm not going to lie. I've read this paper multiple times, and it's really hard to like remember a lot of the earlier aspects of it. So can you talk a little bit about it, your take?
Yeah. So first, let's just pick up on that point you just made. You're by no means a unskilled or amateur reader, and you had a hard time comprehending what was in this paper. And I think that, the big papers that have like 700 samples or even 500 samples or maybe even 300 samples are just too big for even sophisticated readers to comprehend everything that's being said. There's too many points being made over too many regions and too many time periods with too many small exceptions to each one. And And so I've found myself to be embarrassed that papers that I'm a co-author on made small points that I'd totally forgotten. And I read these papers, but I had forgotten that the paper said that. That's kind of what you're referring to. There's just so much said in the Southern Arc papers that I think it's too much. It's too much to consume. But one of the things that you're pulling out the origin of the Indo-European languages. There was a certain amount of conflation going on there. There's movements of Caucasus ancestry into the steppe very early, but it doesn't account for much very early. So it's like 5% of ancestry of a variety of hunter-gatherers in the Dnieper Valley, in the Volga Valley. There's a little bit of Caucasus ancestry out there by 6,000 BC, and that's a different kind. That's probably Caucasus real hunter-gatherers, and they're poorly documented. Whoever it was they're not sampled genetically. Whoever it was who imparted that little bit of ancestry, and then around when the first time we have a real population of southern farmers, and when I say southern, I mean south of the North Caucasus Ridge, which is this permanently glaciated ridge, very difficult to get across, that goes between the Middle East, essentially, and the Eurasian steppes. And the first time farmers went over that ridge and settled the North Caucasus slopes facing the steppes was about 4,500, 4,700 BC. And we have DNA from those people. And it's very much southern DNA, Caucasus DNA, and not steppe DNA. And from then on, starting about 4,500 BC, that kind of ancestry leaks up into the steppes at a much higher rate. So that's what you have to start looking at. Does that have something to do with the origins of Proto-Indo-European, that mixture of ancestries of the first Caucasus farmers? There's a culture called Maikop that starts around 3,800 BC, and they're different. I'm talking about the first farmers who are much simpler than Maikop. And during that period, there's a lot of evidence that there was a lot of back and forth, archaeological evidence that there's a lot of back and forth movement and trade there. So it's conceivable that they shared a common language. You could put a homeland in a region that would include both the steppes north of the Caucasus and these early farmers coming into the steppes. And you can't really say whether it would be a Caucasus language that would be adopted by the steppe people or a steppe language that would be adopted by the Caucasus people based on DNA or archaeology even. It's difficult to say. My only guidance is that the languages that we know today and have known since ancient history in the Caucasus are not Indo-European languages, with the exception of Armenian. They're quite different. Hurrian, Hattic, the Northwest Caucasian, the Northeast Caucasian, Kartvelian. These are distinctly non-Indo-European languages. And so I would guess that the first farmers who went over the North Caucasus in 4,500 BC probably spoke a language that wasn't an ancestor of Indo-Europe. It might have been a substrate of Proto-Indo-European and affected the form of Proto-Indo-European, but not the actual ancestor of Proto-Indo-European. And I think that Joseph Lazaridis thinks that it might have been Proto-Indo-European. That's where we differ. It's not a huge difference. It's going to have to be solved by much, much better genetic sampling and archaeology in that area. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so let me I want to put you mentioned the Maikop. I want to get a little context for the listener. This period before 3000 BC, 3100 BC. We talk about history. History exists, and then we have prehistory. Obviously, it overlaps depending on where you're talking about. The Maikop people were part of this trade network that was really, really humming prehistorically between 3100 and let's say 4000. And they were the northern end of this network that included the Uruk civilization, which was actually a pretty big deal. We don't have any writing from the period, so we don't know politically, socially what was going on, but it clearly expanded out of what we call today Mesopotamia, and the towns in places like in Syria, in parts of Anatolia, are replica copies of the Uruk civilization. And then there was like a massive, massive collapse. And then eventually out of that, over time, evolved what we call the Sumerian civilization, or the Sumerians might have been intrusive. We don't know. But all of a sudden, writing shows up, writing that we can decrypt and we can read, and like the names there, Uruk, the city itself, Epic of Gilgamesh is from this period. But this is actually in the wake of this massive collapse. The massive collapse also tends to correlate with what happened in Europe during the end of the Neolithic, around 3000 BC. So there was a massive, massive disruption around 3000 BC in large parts of Western Eurasia. And I'm not saying that this is like, the flood or the collapse of the end of paradise or whatever we want to say. But I do think some of the myths, because we have myths from the Bronze Age that are not that much further on. And so when they're talking about, great empires and cities, I suspect that they are recollections of something real during the Uruk civilization. And so there was a whole world before the Indo-Europeans. And in my conversation with J.P. Mallory, actually, a couple of years ago, around the same time I talked to you, one thing that he said to me, being an archaeologist, is, one of the reasons we talk about graves with the Indo-Europeans all the time is there wasn't much going on in the early period of their expansion. We had these massive megalith civilizations. We had, the Cucutinia, Tripolia, these big villages in Romania and Moldova. And, these nomads, battle axe people show up, and, they're kind of like reappropriating these megaliths in some way. So, people like to talk about how, these great Indo-Europeans came and they conquered and all that stuff. But there was a lot that happened before that kind of set, I think, the terms for the world that they're expanding into. And I think we need to keep that in mind. So speaking of that world, I want to talk about corded ware. I want to talk about globular amphora. There's a new paper. I don't think actually it's a preprint. The Stone Age Eurasia preprint. I'll put a link to it. Kristian Kristiansen's on it, along with 2,700 other people. No, sorry. I don't know what to say about some of these preprints, because there's like one author, there's like three authors I know, and then like a village, so I don't know if the modern samples are from the authors themselves. There's enough individuals, but this preprint talks about globular amphora and corded ware and how that's the Neolithic ancestry. So there is, this is part of the Southern Arc paper, but also it seems to be expanding this idea that the Indo-European expansion, the Yamnaya expansion, had some internal structure where perhaps the Armenians, I saw a recent ancient DNA paper about the Illyrians, the Albanian region, and maybe the Greeks do not have, and also the Afanassivo, obviously, in the Altai. So maybe the proto-Tarquarians do not have the Neolithic farmer ancestry of the globular amphora, whereas almost all the other Indo-Europeans, like in Europe, and then obviously the Indo-Iranians, have the globular amphora ancestry. So the corded ware is like one branch, and then the other branch are other offshoots of the Yamnaya. What do you think about this model?
Yeah, I think that Yamnaya is clearly the ancestor of almost everything, with the exception of the Anatolian languages, which we're still not sure how they ended up in Anatolia, and there's debate about that. So if we just set those aside and we talk about the origin of what's commonly called core Proto-Indo-European or nuclear Proto-Indo-European, or I call it late Proto-Indo-European, that's Yamnaya is the root of all existing Indo-European languages. And I think what the DNA shows, which models onto what you would expect from linguistics, is that there's an initial fairly massive migration into southeastern Europe, as far west as the Tisza River, where it seems to solidify and stop. And that's an ecological boundary. On the east side of the Tisza River is the Alfold, a big plain, a very steppe-like region, and on the west side is broken uplands. It's a very different topography. So they stop at the Tisza River. On the west, they go as far as the Altai Mountains in Mongolia, where they appear as the Afanassivo culture, And all of this happens 5,000 kilometers across the heart of Eurasia, huge migration, changing the demography within all of those regions between about 3,100 and 2,900 BC. It's a very rapid move. And then a mixed population becomes Corded Ware that has 70% Yamnaya ancestry and then has globular amphora ancestry and maybe a few others. And Corded Ware actually did, besides covering most of Central and Northern Europe, a Corded Ware offshoot, Fatyanovo, actually did a counter movement. They were started in the Baltic and went back through the Russian forest, back towards the east, introducing cattle pastoralism to what had been hunter-gatherers in the Russian forests. That movement went back into the steppes, carrying Corded Ware ancestry with it, and then that mixed Corded Ware ancestry ultimately showed up in South Asia. Now, the population that stayed behind in the steppes when the migration to the west happened turned into late Yamnaya and Catacomb. They did not have the Corded Ware ancestry. And a group of them, according to the Southern Arc paper, this is one of the discoveries, I think, in the Southern Arc paper, a group of them moved south into what is today Armenia, and it's probably the origin of the Armenians. Around 2500 BC, which is just when archaeologically you see the introduction of large kurgans with wheeled vehicles and horses underneath them. And archaeologists have always wondered if this represented an intrusion of steppe people. We were not able to determine that before because we didn't have the DNA. Now we do have DNA, and it was an intrusion of steppe people. So it's very likely, and given the relationship linguistically between Armenian, Greek, and Indo-Iranian, it's very easy to put movement south into the Caucasus around 2500 BC, connected to Sintashta just up to the northeast, and to Proto-Greek off to the west, all of them sharing common ancestry, with Sintashta having more Corded Ware ancestry. And when the steppe people moved into what is today Armenia, they carried with them the Yamnaya Y chromosome, the Y haplogroup, Z2103, which is typical of Yamnaya. The only place it survives in any appreciable frequency today is Armenia, where it's very widespread, and it's died out everywhere else. And that's a tracer of this very ancient movement of people off the steppes into Armenia. And I think it also tends to support what linguists had previously determined, that there is a branching relationship between Armenian, Greek, and probably Indo-Iranian. That puts them all right there in that same stretch of the steppes around, say, 2500 BC. It also solves some other problems. There's the relationship between Balto-Slavic and Indo-Iranian. And it's always seemed odd that linguists found this very close relationship in terms of linguistic structure between Balto-Slavic and Indo-Iranian, given that they're so far apart in the modern world. But when this Fatyanovo late Corded Ware migration was happening from the Baltic back into the steppes to become Sintashta, at around 2000 BC, Sintashta and the Fatyanovo people who came from the Baltic were at two ends of a dialect chain. And it totally explains the relationship between emerging Indo-Iranian and emerging Balto-Slavic. So there's a number of things about this steppe hypothesis that fit really well with little problems in linguistic relationships. And they're also supported by archaeology. I mean, the movement south into Armenia around 2500 BC has been recognized for decades by archaeologists as a really important change in the cultures of the Caucasus. But whether it was a migration or just a local emulation of some steppe customs by local people was impossible to determine without DNA. And the Southern Arc paper is the first paper that really supplied that DNA. But it's such a big paper that discovery is kind of muffled in the rest of all of the other things that were discovered there.
So just to be clear, do you think that the Greeks, the Proto-Greeks, were not part of the Corded Ware expansion? Because I know there were Yamnaya people that were in, the Hungarian steppe area and also in like the lower Danube and stuff like that. Do you think that the Proto-Greeks and the Proto-Illyrians might have been this earlier wave?
Yeah, Proto-Greek is hard to figure out. A Greek itself, it's beginning to be clear that it arrived in the Aegean and in Greece relatively late. There's not a lot of steppe ancestry, if any, in the Aegean area before the Middle Bronze Age. There's none in the early Bronze Age. And so it doesn't look like people with steppe ancestry got into the Aegean before about 2200 BC, which is the same time that the Dom 2 horses spread everywhere, and with chariotry, perhaps. So they might have been introducing chariots from the steppes through the Carpathians. There are tell sites that have a lot of horse bones in western Romania, eastern Hungary, and they have cheek pieces, like Santashta cheek pieces. So there may have been Proto-Greeks involved in the transfer of chariot technology from the steppes down into the Balkans, but by 2000 BC they were in Greece. I do think there was there's a really interesting border. You talk about expansion from the steppes, but it really had limits. The initial expansion stopped in the west at the Tisa River, and beyond that you had this much more admixed population that became Corded Ware, and it's a much more variable population genetically. And south of that, too, you have to think about south of that. There was also a border south of that sort of ran through Albania, North Macedonia, Bulgaria. And south of that, you don't see steppe ancestry for another 1,000 years. It just stopped from 3000 to 2000 BC. And somewhere along in there is where I think Proto-Greek was emerging. But I think the Armenian problem helps to solve the Proto-Greek problem because it pulls it towards the steppes. Because it looks like the Armenian entered the Caucasus from the north around 2500 BC. It's closely related to Greek, and so Greek must have been out there to the west of it somewhere.
All right, so I have this is in my notes, and so I do want to ask this question. Neither of us are linguists, but you've collaborated with and been around linguists forever. I have talked to classicists and other people who have told me, look, when you look at ancient Greek, when you look at Sanskrit, when you look at these languages, they just look way more diverged than languages that have been separated for a couple of thousand years. So, for example, the Romance languages have been separated for, I don't know, like they've been evolving for like 1,000, 1,500 years. They're quite recognizable to each other. And, I don't know, Sanskrit, Greek, we have them pretty early. We have Hittite, obviously. Some of these languages are pretty ancient. We have a little bit of the Mitanni, some of those like gods and stuff like that. So what's going on here? What do you say to them? Because they want to say like, look, this is just like too much difference to be explained by some expansion 3,500 years ago.
Yeah, it wasn't 3,500. Well, I mean, it depends on which expansion you're talking about.
Sorry, I meant BC. So yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah. So the expansion. Yeah. So that's 5,000 years ago. And I agree that the Romance languages have had 1,000, 1,500 years to differentiate, and they're very recognizably part of the same clade. Give it another 1,500 or 1,000 years, and then give it another 1,500 or 1,000 years, and let's see what happens. And that's really the time depth that we're dealing with. I think we have enough time for these changes to happen. The one that's really not calibrated well, because we don't really know when it happened or how, is the separation of Anatolian, which was appears to retain archaisms that were lost in all of the other Indo-European languages.
Well, so let me ask you about Anatolian, because I saw a map of distribution of these Anatolian languages like Luvian and stuff and Palaean and all these things. They're more shifted to the west in Anatolia. Is that correct? Because the Hattian language is more to the center east, which is not Indo-European. Perhaps it's related to Urian, I don't know, but it's definitely not Indo-European. And so this to me suggests there's an old model of the Anatolian languages coming in through the Balkans. I don't know. But in any case, like, can you just speak to that a little bit?
Oh, you're talking about the geographic distribution of Anatolian languages. It's really hard to know what the geographic distribution was in the very beginning. Say going back to 1900 BC, when you begin to see Hittite names mentioned in the Assyrian merchants' colony at Kultepe on the Halis River, and that's in central Anatolia. But most of the linguists I've talked to, for instance, at the UCLA conference last November, were of the opinion that the Anatolian Indo-European speakers were intrusive in Anatolia, that they didn't belong there, that they're surrounded by people who were autochthonous and spoke Hattic. They spoke, this is another language we don't really know except by a few names, Kaska, which was north of the Hattic speakers on the south coast of the Black Sea, and they were the arch enemies of the Hatti speakers. And they don't seem to have been Indo-European either. They may have ultimately knocked off the Hittite Empire later on. You have the Hurrian speakers who are distributed in the same geographic area as the Kura-Araxes culture archaeologically around 3000 BC. And then you have all of these Caucasian languages, Northwest, Northeast, and Kartveli and South Caucasian. There's not a lot of room there, except in Western Anatolia, for Indo-European languages to be spoken. But I'm not sure they were originally spoken there either. You could, that Palaic was spoken in the north on the Black Sea. What's it doing up there? Maybe it came in from the Balkans. I don't know. Hittite is spoken in central Anatolia, and Luwian seems to have been originally spoken south of Hittite. So there might be a sort of a north-south line of Indo-European languages extending maybe from the south coast up to the north coast of the Anatolian Peninsula. I'm not sure. It's difficult to map that.
There are still mysteries in the world, I guess. I mean, we still haven't found steppe ancestry in these Indo-European Anatolians yet, correct?
No, we have not. Yeah.
Okay. So that's look, there's things that there's more than can be dreamt in our philosophy at this point. Well, someday maybe we'll figure it out. I want to ask you, and I know we've been talking for a while, but there's a couple other things I want to ask you about because, all right, in your notes to me, as we were talking, you have some strong opinions about the origin of Corded Ware and Yamnaya and the arguments that are happening online. Look, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't really understand how some people get so exorcised by some of these. I mean, look, I'm super interested, but some of the stuff online is out of control. I don't really get it. So I'm just going to be honest about that. But I know that there's a lot of passions. So, both you and Kristian Kristiansen seem to be of the opinion that, look, we should just say that these earliest steppe people in Northern Europe, they're basically Yamnaya or very recent. And there are other people that have a model, I think like Eurogenes, David Eurogenes, for example, but there's others that maybe the Corded Ware are a sister group that has some admixture from some Eastern European hunter-gatherers genetically. We also know the Y chromosome Corded Ware, these early Corded Ware, just for listeners out there, Eastern Poland, Belarus, that area, South Baltic, let's say about 5,000 years ago, these people have R1A, where the Yamnaya had an exotic branch of R1B that's mostly in Armenia now. Okay, so, in your notes, you have a lot of comments about this. Just talk to me about this thing, what your opinion is.
Yeah, so I'm interested in, as you are, in the passion that attaches to this argument, and I'm not sure what the source of it is. It seems to me like there's a strong resistance to having Indo-European origins be in the steppes, and particularly having it be steppe nomads. And this may be because steppe nomads have been used throughout history as a representation of crude, brutal barbarians like the Dothraki in the Game of Thrones, and who are an absurd imitation of nomads. But I'm not. Maybe that's it. That you don't want to trace your linguistic ancestry to nomads. But that would be a really kind of ridiculous reason to make these very. I think the arguments about this are don't have much validity. That number one, corded ware has 60-70%, depending on the individual you look at, steppe ancestry. And the suggestion was that maybe some minority of corded ware individuals, a minority, have another form of ancestry that's maybe from the Baltic, but it could also be from Ukraine Neolithic. And what they're looking at is an excess of EHG in a few samples in a minority of corded ware individuals. And then they use that minority to say, well, all of corded ware is maybe not inherited from Yamnaya, doesn't have direct Yamnaya ancestry. Maybe there was no Yamnaya migration into Central Europe. It was just parallel processes and siblings, as you say. I think the evidence shows that Yamnaya is earlier than corded ware. Number one, there's very good radiocarbon data that show the earliest Yamnaya dates are late 4th millennium. The earliest corded ware dates are early 4th millennium, and the late Yamnaya ones are late 4th millennium. And the 3300 BC opposed to 2900 BC. And so first, Yamnaya is earliest. It could have been the parent of corded ware. Corded ware has 60-70% Yamnaya ancestry. There's IBD that hasn't been published yet that shows that Yamnaya people were the direct ancestors of corded ware people. And also, finally, the excess of EHG that's talked about. This is discussed in another lost section of 2 or 3 paragraphs in the Southern Art paper, where Lazaridis talks about this specifically and says, this excess of EHG ancestry is easily within the variation of Yamnaya and could easily have been delivered directly from Yamnaya ancestry. There's no reason to invoke a ghost population from the forest steppe, which has been picked up in the Hegarty paper. He has completely bought the idea that there was a ghost population in the forest steppe that delivered much of this ancestry to corded ware. And I'm with Kristian Kristiansen that we should just admit that corded ware has primarily Yamnaya ancestry. It's variable across corded ware, but there are some almost pure Yamnaya individuals all the way up in Latvia. There are almost pure Yamnaya individuals all over the range of corded ware except for Switzerland. I think if you just look at the data, it's pretty clear that corded ware derives genetically, largely from Yamnaya. There's one other argument in the horse domestication paper by Labrado. They said that the corded ware horses are local North European horses, and if Yamnaya had rode into Central and Northern Europe, they should have rode in on steppe horses. So you should see steppe horse DNA in corded ware horses, and you don't see that. Well, all of their corded ware horses were from one site up in the mountains of Germany, not a very good place for horses, and a reanalysis of their data in a paper Meyer et al. Out of the Reich lab has shown, it's published in Cell, has shown that they get much better fits to Labrado et al.'s data than Labrado et al. Did themselves using a different algorithm. And the best fitting model shows about 20% steppe ancestry in these same corded ware horses from the mountainside in Germany. So if you put that together with the evidence for riding pathologies in Yamnaya individuals, then I think you can make a case that horseback riding was involved in the spread of Yamnaya ancestry from the steppes up into corded ware in Central and Northern Europe.
Yeah, I mean, the whole domestic animal, inheritance and admixture patterns are kind of strange. I'm going to get to that. I want to talk about that real quick, but I want to say you said something about IBD, identity by descent, and I know about this from I think Nick Patterson told me about this work a while ago, and so that basically means there are near relatives that you guys are finding across these archaeological cultures. So one thing that we do is we look at admixture percentages and we create these population graphs, et cetera, which you guys are finding with the ancient DNA and the low coverage IBD analyses are relatives across the steppe, relatives across cultures. You're finding kinship networks, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. IBD, there's the DNA itself, analyses of the autosomal DNA can show if you're a first degree, a second degree, or a third degree relative. And that goes out to grandparents or maybe great grandparents and cousins. And then beyond that, first cousins. And then beyond that range of relationships, you can't really see it using standard genetic methods, but using IBD, you can. And then you can say these people are relatives. They share an ancestor that's not a father or a grandfather, but they share an ancestor that's 3 or 4 generations farther back, and but they're still relatives, and that's an important thing to be able to say. And we've seen now shared IBD segments between individuals that are buried in, and can you believe this, individuals that are buried in Slovakia, Yamnaya individual in Slovakia, and a Yamnaya individual almost in Mongolia, in the Altai, share a common ancestor that's about 5 generations back. And they're separated by 5,000 kilometers. It's this huge distance. And yet they share IBD. So they definitely had a common ancestor, and they're relatives.
Yeah. So on the domestication part, one thing I want to bring out, I think we've talked about this before, but if we haven't, I'll bring it up again. Anders Bergstrom's paper from a couple of years ago about dogs. They had some of the dogs from your sample, and I want to close up this conversation with the dogs of war and all that stuff. They had some of the samples from your dogs, and they didn't find very much steppe. I mean, the dogs in Europe, the modern dogs in general, are disproportionately European. These European Anatolian dogs, and also a little bit of Baltic. So they're synthesis of Baltic and Anatolian. There was also a steppe dog. Steppe dogs are distinct. Those are your samples that you and your wife got, and the one place in the world that they find an appreciable amount of steppe dog ancestry now, though, outside the steppe, is in China. And so that, to me, is suggesting, I mean, what was going on with Indo-Europeans in China? We haven't talked about this. You probably know Christopher Beckwith's work. There are weird things in the Ordos, in that, for the listeners, like there's a loop, the Ordos Plain. Early Chinese civilization, we know it comes out of Hainan. We know the Shang Dynasty and all this stuff. They have these light war chariots. Those light war chariots, we know where they got them from. They got them from my forefathers. Like, let's be real about it, you know? Yeah. So it's like, did they like, was it through the internet? No, they were like, there were people there that were, probably teaching them, or mercenaries or what. And so do you have any opinions of contacts between, and we have genes from Mongolia. There were Indo-Iranians there, Iranians, those fractions decreased later with a resurgence of, Mongolic to Tungusic ancestry. So there was a lot of stuff going on in the East with Indo-Europeans. I mean, Tokharians are pretty famous because they're so exotic. But do you have anything to say about that? Like, any thoughts?
Well, there's right at the beginning, in the initial expansion that brought Yamnaya people out to the Altai, where they're the Afanasyevo culture. There is an Afanasyevo grave that we have DNA from that's in central Mongolia that has IBD relationships with a Afanasyevo individual back in the Altai. And this guy is way out there to the east from regular Afana. He's well beyond the Afanasyevo culture area. But it's an isolated migration. It probably didn't result in any demographic change in the area where he went, but if there's one, there's more. And there's a lot of DNA coming out of later graves in the Tarim Basin, showing steppe ancestry mixtures. So yeah, I think that people with steppe ancestry and steppe dogs probably came right up to the borders of Chinese civilization. And maybe steppe dogs were more useful there. I can see how in Europe, where after the Corded Ware period, and Bellbeaker and later, everybody settled down. Even the people with steppe ancestry became sedentary. They were not able to maintain a mobile lifestyle in forested Europe. It's just better suited to agriculture. So this very mobile economy that was introduced with corded ware settled down pretty rapidly, and that's when they switched back to local European dogs, who maybe were better suited to being on a farm than the steppe dogs were. And the steppe dogs were maybe better, more useful out on the northwestern frontiers of China, and so they were maintained there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's so many paths we could go down. So I've had you for a while. So like let's talk about a couple of years ago. You have this book tentatively titled Dogs of War. I know that you're working on it, and there's no like end date, I guess. But like tell us about what's going on with that, because like people want to know, inquiring minds.
Yeah, so I'm still working on it. I've got a couple of chapters written that I can write without knowing. There's a big Yamnaya DNA paper pending from the Reich lab. And obviously I couldn't write that book until I knew what that paper was going to say. and it's taken a while, but it's coming along. So there is major progress has been done. And I think that we might see a paper, sometime maybe before Christmas. I'm hopeful. I've said that before. But
Wait, can you tell me if the paper is shorter? Is it more digestible than the Southern Arc paper?
Yes. I don't think it'll have to be broken into 3 parts. We're trying to do that. I think there's enough self-awareness among this group of authors that the really big ones are hard to digest, and consequently people don't really refer to them. There's obviously they refer to them to a certain extent, but it's easier to refer to them if the individual discoveries are separated from each other. So I think this one there is going to be 2 papers, but the biggest one is still not going to be as big as the Southern Arc.
Okay, well, I mean that. Thank you, because that'll be easier. So one thing, I want to ask you this, because like I thought about this for a while and I don't know what to think about it. I talked to Alice Evans. She's a economic historian about patriarchy, patrilineal societies, and obviously Eurasian nomads are generally patrilineal. We got all these Y chromosomes. So you talked about R1b. There's the exotic branch. I mean, I'll say it's not really exotic. It's just the old branch associated with the Yamnaya. There's another R1b that's really common in Western Europe. There's R1a. There's the Western type of R1a that's common in Slavs, and there's a branch in Scandinavia with the Badlax people. And then there's my family's branch, R1a Z90. We got all these Y chromosomes that are just exploding in star phylogeny. Star phylogeny is just demographic expansion. What do you think about why you see this with Indo-Europeans and nomads? Like, do you have a hypothesis? I know you're a empirical scientist, archaeologist, but theoretically, like, what's going on here? Because you don't see this in the Middle East, you don't see this in China until relatively recently, historically, but on the steppe, you see these and then replacements, and you also see it in even Germany with I1. I1 shows up 1800 BC, and now it's the dominant one in Scandinavia.
Okay, so I think the important thing is the series of replacements. It's not just the expansion; it's the replacement that attracts people's attention. So there's a particular kind of R1b that spread with Yamnaya, Z2103, and that spread up to the Tisza River, and then when corded ware was formed, beyond that boundary, there were a variety of different Y haplogroups in the beginning, according to paper by Papach et al., and there's a new one by Hack et al. In a book edited by Thomas Olander. In the beginning of corded ware, there's actually quite a lot of variety in Y haplogroups, but they settle in late corded ware on R1a, and I think that represents. And then when Bellbeaker expands out of corded ware, the corded ware haplogroups are replaced by yet another L51, a different haplogroup. And so as steppe ancestry expanded into Europe, it did so under the guise of a series of replacement Y haplogroups. And I think that what was happening, and this is my own theory, I haven't convinced everybody of this by a long shot, but I think that what was happening is that in the steppes when Yamnaya was formed, being buried under a kurgan was reserved for an elite. And the people who were building the kurgans had different Y groups. They were there, but they're not documented because they weren't allowed to be buried under a kurgan. When they got to the edge of the expansion, they escaped from the hegemony of these R1Bs, and the R1As did the same thing. They recreated the same system of hegemony for one a male patrilineage. These are competing male patrilineages, which is quite common among nomads. And then when the further expansion happened west, that was done by yet another competing male patrilineage that established the same thing. And it wasn't until you get to Unetich and the beginning of the classical Bronze Age in Central Europe that you really begin to get some diversity in Y haplogroups again, and that system finally falls apart. But during the initial expansion of steppe ancestry, I think there were these competing male lineages who got buried under the kurgans or under the corded ware graves, and the people who weren't the right people didn't get buried there. They were just excluded socially.
I see. It's almost like yeah, you're basically suggesting there's just like an ascertainment bias in the Y chromosomes that we see.
Yes, exactly. I think that they were more diverse than what we see archaeologically. Yeah.
All right. Okay, so I've had you for a while. Closing thoughts. It's been a couple of years. It's going to be a couple of more years. I know, David, reading your book all those years ago, and you've been involved in this for so long now. All these papers are coming down. I mean, it's an embarrassment of riches, right? It's like too much.
It is. It is.
I mean, it must be weird.
I didn't know that this was going to happen. When I started looking at Indo-European language connections with archaeology when I was a graduate student in the 70s, it was not a popular thing to do. And I was sort of a fringe. I do think I was operating on the fringes there of the central concerns of archaeology, and now it's become a central concern. And so I'm kind of lucky that the advances in methodology have swung the whole field around to incorporate what I was doing. But it's amazing to me to see this sudden attention on a subject that was really avoided by archaeologists for generations.
Yeah, I mean, I think I told you this story about my former boss, Spencer Wells. I think it was the late 1990s when he first started doing M17 mutation in R1A. And I think he was doing a job talk at Oxford. I think it was at Oxford or Cambridge, one of the two. And they asked about, how this spread. And he was like, oh, probably steppe nomads. And a bunch of archaeologists, I think, got up and were like, we don't believe in any of that anymore. That's very outmoded. So timing matters. That's all I got to say. Timing matters.
It does. It's very interesting to be here now, isn't it? I mean, it's just a fascinating field. It's hard to keep up with anymore.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you just taking time out to talk and helping us keep up. And, I'll be reading the papers and, getting your wisdom and experience. I mean, all I can say is I think, my listeners and myself, we share your infectious enthusiasm. We're very excited. Science is hard, and a lot of times you're searching in the dark for data, and now the data is coming to us. And I think the thing that I would say is it's on us now to interpret it and understand it and figure out what our ancestors did, how it happened. We have the technology, we have this ancient DNA technology, we have the computation. Hopefully we have time. You have time now. And I think one thing I would ask people is let's take the temperature down. There's a little harsh words that go back and forth sometimes, and it really is a little difficult for me to understand where that's coming from, because ultimately we're all in it for the same thing. We're in it for the truth, right? And I think we're getting there. So just be cool, people. Be cool. Read the papers, and let's have our disagreements civilly, because ultimately we have the same goal, even if we have different possible paths to get to that goal. That's what I would say.
That's absolutely true, Razib. I agree with everything you just said. Yeah, just be cool and keep working. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, guys. It was a great conversation. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see the rest of you online. And David, same with you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Razib. It was a great pleasure.
This podcast was brought to you by ORCID, the only whole genome sequencing company focused on embryos. You know that genetics plays a big role in our health. 30% of neurodevelopmental diseases, 10 to 40% of pediatric cancers, and more than 30% of birth defects have a known genetic cause. Families considering IVF use ORCID to see which of their embryos have these conditions and work with doctors to choose their lowest risk embryo so they can have a successful pregnancy and a healthy baby. Check them out at orchidhealth.com and use code RAZIB, R-A-Z-I-B, when signing up to skip the wait list.
This podcast for kids